Thank you. We now move to our last round of paper speakers. And closing the case for the proposition tonight is Mr. Jaiveer Singh. Jaiveer is an MPhil Politics and International student at St. Edmund's College, researching the economic and legal fundamentals of currency internationalization. He won the right to speak through open audition. Jaiveer, you have the floor.
Good evening, Madam President, opposition and proposition benches, members of the Cambridge Union. I rise before this august House to defend the motion, "This House regrets the West's approach to Russia." I aim to provide a third world perspective to this debate. When I sat down to write my speech, I had two basic questions in mind. One, technical, and the other, substantive. The technical question was, what really is the composition of the House I'm trying to convince tonight? And more importantly, the substantive one being, what is actually the West's approach to Russia? I believe it will be fair for me to assume this House has a universal character, somewhat on the lines of a General Assembly, and not merely a bipolar lens of analysis resulting in an East versus West narrative. Coming to the more substantive question, what is the West's approach to Russia? What is the end goal of the American foreign policy towards Russia? Is it to impose a liberal world order? Is it containment? Or is it something else? Perhaps a minimal working relationship to keep aggression in check? Or in a best-case scenario, does the Western foreign policy aim to preserve its dominance and keep the Eastern Bloc fragmented? Through the course of my speech, I shall demonstrate how the West has failed on all these fronts, and that is why we regret the current approach towards Russia. I do not want to get into somewhat fashionable liberal bashing or, on the contrary, deliver a sermon on morality. And I say this simply because we are debating foreign policy, an area where national interest rules, shrewd decision-making is common, and the past actions of your rivals, albeit wrong, are used to justify your present actions. The phrase, "two wrongs don't make a right," has little relevance in this arena, and no bloc is immune from realpolitik decision-making. Ladies and gentlemen, I shall defend the motion by raising three arguments. First, the weaponization of economic tools by the West is counterproductive. Second, the notion of absolute sovereignty needs to be balanced with those of balance of power and spheres of influence. And third, the West is indirectly helping its greatest competition, China, with a permanent ally. Coming to my first argument, the weaponization of economic tools by the West is counterproductive. In a constantly changing geopolitical scenario where Pax Americana is giving way to a more multipolar decision-making system, the US could still boast of near absolute financial hegemony till the 26th of February 2022, a day when it decided to block the Russian Federation's access to the largest payments infrastructure, SWIFT. While trumpeters of the West welcomed such a decision, a silent strategic class of foreign policy experts and neorealists of the Kissinger School openly propounded that the doctrine of coercive diplomacy was reaching its limits. By initiating a short-term sanction of a till-date foolproof payments infrastructure, whose greatest selling point, like the US dollar, was the liquid nature of market provisions and easiest transaction procedures, the US and its allies have done themselves a long-term harm. It has opened the doors of serious competition in the payments infrastructure sector, where China's cross-border interbank payment system was far behind. This has rather vindicated the Bank of Russia's strategy to diversify away from US-based assets to gold. Let's analyze some data. Russia has been the largest buyer of gold in recent years, quadrupling Russia's gold reserves over the past decade. From 2018 to 2019, a one-year period, the value of Russia's gold reserves increased by 42% to 110 billion US dollars. By June 2020, 23% of Russia's central bank reserves consisted of gold, while the dollar's share, the erstwhile dominating reserve currency for Russia, decreased to 22%. By the end of 2020, more than 83% of Russian exports to China were in euros. The euro has now supplanted the US dollar as the principal trading currency between Russia and China. We can just gauge the acceleration of Russia's willingness to withdraw from America's financial domination by appreciating just one data point. Russian holdings of US treasuries dropped from $100 billion to nearly $15 billion in less than 1 year, 2017 to 2018. And this isn't an aberration. The holdings have remained this low ever since. An 85% decline in less than 12 months. This was the speed at which US was losing control of the Russian financial market. With the blocking of SWIFT, the US seems to have made up its mind to effectively lose control over the leftover 15% as well. Sanctions against Russia have also failed to realize their presumed twin objectives of penalizing Russia for its aggression and eventually forcing Russia to stop the war. Neither has happened. While it is true that the Russian people faced economic hardships in the starting months of the war, Europeans had to face equal or perhaps greater hardships. The prime example here is the European energy sanctions that caused a massive hike in gas and oil prices well before the European Union member states were ready to forego Russian supplies. While Russian oil export revenues increased by $115 billion in 2022, and gas exports by $27.2 billion, the European nations, including UK and Switzerland, had to spend at least 500 billion euros in subsidies to keep energy affordable. Yes, sir?
In the early months of the war, Europe didn't find billions in oil and gas from Russia. Isn't that the real reason why the immediate short-term left sanctions didn't work? Because we didn't have guts to cut supply from Russia.
I think you have a point, but I believe that the initial cutting of supplies of oil and gas from Europe did result in economic hardships as soon as the war was starting. And data speaks that Russia actually benefited or rather profited from such sanctions because they had other players like India and China to get a lot of Russian oil on discount. The French opposition leader, Marine Le Pen, has constantly attributed rising living costs to the war in Ukraine and its funding by the West. Similarly, majority of US Republicans already feel that the West is giving too much money to Ukraine. Sanctions affecting common people lead to a greater perception of victimhood amongst the masses and strengthens nationalist feelings, a result which makes Putin's position domestically even more stronger, thus negating a highly unlikely Western aim to weaken or remove the Russian president, if at all there was any. But this aspect just doesn't stop here. The West did lose all moral grounds to preach to other countries to stop purchasing Russian oil when it itself started buying rerouted Russian oil being processed in India. Furthermore, the Western approach to scaremonger confiscation of Russian assets in the West is at best immature. This rhetoric is problematic at three levels. One, it gives Russia an opportunity to use the same argument to justify its confiscation of Western assets in Russia. Furthermore, only a quarter of all Western companies that officially announced they were terminating business in Russia completely exited the Russian market. Two, a large section of New York and London's real estate market is dependent on Russian investment. And thirdly, just simply on principle, this would amount to the gravest violation of right to property, a hitherto sacrosanct principle of the liberal world order. Hence, has the West been successful in its policy for containment, for which financial dependence of Russia was a key aspect? The answer is a resounding no. I shall not be taking any further points of information. Moving on to my second argument, the notion of absolute sovereignty needs to be balanced with those of balance of power and spheres of influence. In 1990, James Baker, the then US Secretary of State, remarked, "Not an inch to the east will NATO progress." As of today, Russia's military expenditure is 1/7 of NATO's military budget. Russia's per capita GDP is 1/4 of NATO's per capita GDP. The West needs to realize that its rival is a cornered, weak animal which feels threatened. It needs to be coaxed and calmed, not irritated. I fail to understand the rhetoric of NATO welcoming Ukraine when Germany had a virtual veto and wasn't in favor of this joining. While the Russians compared the breach of sphere of influence with the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the American sphere of influence was breached, I ask a rather simple question today. The primary reason which started the war was Ukraine's membership of NATO. It is May 2024, 27 months since the start of the war. Is Ukraine today a member of NATO? The answer is no. Is Ukraine even a member of the European Union? The answer is no. I regret this Western policy, which cannot even live up to the primary promise for which its ally is facing aggression. Good words are fine if one is capable of enforcing them. The West, regrettably, has a very poor track record on this front. When the US Army generals were willing to attack, the then US National Security Advisor, Hadley, remarked, "Are we willing to go to war with Russia over Georgia?" Today, what is the West willing to do? Is it willing to go to war over Ukraine? Is it even willing to fully and sustainably fund Ukraine's war expenses? The answer is no. Winston Churchill famously propounded his three war aims at the end of the Second World War: in defeat, defiance; in victory, magnanimity; and in peace, goodwill. It is regrettable that a pitiful Yeltsin didn't get enough economic support from the US during the democratic transition in 1991, which is a point of absolute Western victory, a point where history had changed and the West's rule was paramount. The West was not magnanimous. I have to skip my third argument, which was the West indirectly helping its greatest competition, China, because of time constraints. In conclusion, presently, the West has not been able to agree on what kind of goal it is ultimately pursuing vis-à-vis Russia. This lack of clarity undermines Western policy. In the end, I conclude by saying that the West can present, or at least try to present, a unified front of a rules-based order by demonstrating to hitherto non-aligned states that the world's problems are West's problems as well, and not just the other way around. Thank you.